Hello, everybody, and welcome to A Soulful Revolution, a podcast at the intersection of spiritual transformation and social change. I'm Lauren Grubau-Thomas, a priest, writer, spouse, and twin mama living on the ancestral lands of the Arapaho and Cheyenne peoples in what's commonly known as Littleton, Colorado. My guest today is Marissa Montes. Marissa is the professor and director of Loyola Law School's Immigrant Justice Clinic, a community-based clinic that provides free immigration legal services to the east side of Los Angeles in partnership with Dolores Mission Parish and Homeboy Industries, which is where she and I first met. Marissa has a background in Mexico, which we'll hear more about in today's episode, I'm sure. And recently she's been traveling to Mexico because her clinic now has a partnership doing work with a deportation center that is there. And so looking forward to hearing more about that. Marissa, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It is truly an honor, and I'm so excited to see you because, as you mentioned, we go way back from Homeboy Industries, and it's lovely to see a familiar face and catch up.
Well, I want to begin by offering you the question I offer all my guests, which is to share what it means to you to be a soulful revolutionary.
So it was interesting because I've been hearing your podcasts and I was listening to the responses of others, and it truly made me reflect as like, what does it mean to be a soulful revolutionary? And it's a title that I had never considered myself having, and it's quite special. And I feel quite honored that you would think that that I embody what it means to be a soulful revolutionary. I have been through, I guess, a spiritual journey recently because this work is very personal. And as I've continued to do this work, it's become more and more spiritual. And my basis for this work has always been out of love. This is something that as a professor, I always tell my students is that doing work and serving the immigrant community isn't because I feel a sense of responsibility as an immigrant myself, but it's really a way for me to love and honor not just my ancestors, not just the immigrants that came before me and who paved the way, but just an act of love for my community, because this is my community. And I now want to be able to use my privileges and the sacrifices that everyone has made for me to be in this space to now open the doors for other people like me. And, this work is also just very special, not just because I'm an immigrant myself. I was born in Mexico, came to the United States at the age of 2. But because in my time as a practicing attorney for the last 12 years, the higher powers that be, God, the universe, have demonstrated that this is something that is truly connected to my soul. The work that I do in Boyle Heights is where my grandmother was born and how I was able to derive citizenship. And now I get to go back to the city of my birth that I didn't have a connection with because I grew up here, to now serve the immigrant community in Guadalajara, both deportees and migrants in transit. And about 2 years ago, my cousin and I did a mini Buddhist retreat in Costa Rica. And I was talking to one of the practitioners there. And she asked me about my work and what I was doing. And she told me, your work is working with souls. And she really kind of took me back when she's told me that. And that's been like a repeated message that I've had, like, you work with people directly in situations where no one else is willing to hear them out or offer some sort of support. And you heal souls through your work and through love, she told me. But I also think it's reciprocal in a way, like my community has also supported me and has helped in my healing. And it's really interactions that you have with one another in doing this work. Father Brendan from Dolores Mission always says that when working with the community, you're entering sacred ground. And I truly believe that because I'm entering a space where clients are at their most vulnerable, but yet have so much faith despite being oppressed by judicial systems or systems in general. and being able to offer my privileges and tools and have my students do it too, to solidify that faith is incredibly rewarding. So I don't know if that answers what it means to be a soulful revolutionary, but it is what is meaningful about my work for myself. So yes.
I wonder if you'd share a bit of your background in terms of how the immigration clinic began. I know this is a dream that you cultivated and would love to hear how that dream became reality.
Yeah, no, of course, happy to chat about our history. So just a little bit about myself, as I mentioned, I'm an immigrant myself, and when we came to the United States, my family and I experienced a lot of obstacles, including homelessness. And it was the immigrant community that showed up for us. It wasn't the government, it wasn't another attorney, it wasn't social services, right? And other issues that had come throughout my childhood and adult life, even. It's always been the immigrant community that shows up. And the reason why I say this as a preface is because it's the basis of my lawyering model, right? Is that community recognizes community and understands the needs and the solutions of that community. And that has been something that's been reflected in my life. And so I knew I wanted to be an immigrant rights attorney since I was in high school. And then fast forward, I came into law school. I picked Loyola specifically because of its Jesuit mission. It's a school that really fosters a love for social justice, and I wanted to make sure that I was going to a law school that was going to promote my desire and dream to be a public interest attorney, especially in the immigrant rights setting. But when I came to Loyola, we actually did not have an immigration clinic, which is quite surprising because we are in the heart of LA. We are in Pico Union, a heavily Central American immigrant community. And myself and some other students lobbied the school to basically help start an immigration clinic. And that was the basis of my fellowship project. And at that time, I was working at Homeboy Industries because I was really interested, and a lot of my work still continues at the intersection of immigration consequences of gang involvement or gang association. And the director that was then there, Ellie Miller, told me like, hey, you should go to Dolores Mission as well to offer the services because there's such a big need. So hence why as I always joke around, the Jesuit stars aligned. And Loyola supported our project to serve Homeboy and Dolores Mission through a community-based model. So our community-based model means that I try to, what I teach students is to really challenge the traditional models of lawyering, right, which is top down, right? You as the attorney, as the judicial officer, or the law, is the perceptive, you tell your client, what's just, when it's really the other way around. We are to be of service of our clients. And it's really the community and your clients who are going to understand how the law impacts them on a daily basis, and they're going to know those solutions. So through our work, we go straight to the community. My team and my students go and do offer consultations, and these are the cases we take in-house. So it's what the community needs, like what we take in-house. It's all humanitarian, but it's going to vary depending what the trends that we see. And this also is in terms of our advocacy work. And so we've done stuff like around, DACA workshops, know your rights workshops, legislative advocacy, but the topics that we take on are totally dictated by the community. And now we've been around for 12 years. We've had over 100 law students come through our program. We've maintained a 95% success rate. And now the next step is expanding binationally. And basically our decision to do this step was also based on the needs that we saw reflected in the community. Like when the caravans first started to come and we noticed an influx of recent arrivals, we realized the importance of meeting them before they actually cross. So they're aware of their rights and make informed decisions if they decide to remain in Mexico or come to the United States. And then we specifically are now focusing on geographically in Tijuana and Guadalajara because it is on the route of La Bestia all the way up here to specifically the route that migrants take to get to LA. And then the highest number of deportees in Mexico, or the population, they're concentrated obviously in Baja California because it's close to the border, but in the state of Jalisco because the majority of Mexican nationals outside of Mexico are in California, in LA. So the majority of deportees in that area are former LA residents. So it's the whole idea of serving our community even beyond borders, right? And as our government continues to push its borders outwards, we as advocates also have to move, right? And so our growth and our model has always been dictated about what are the needs of the community, and that's a model that I wanted to just follow based on my own life experience as well, right? The immigrant community knew what my immigrant family needed, and they came up with the solution. So I want to replicate that in our work.
But yeah, I'm thinking about you talking about sacred ground and that encounter from human to human that is really a leveling of power dynamics, and how revolutionary that is truly to do that, especially in a US context where the power differentials are so extreme within systems, especially the judicial system in which you're operating. And so I wonder if you could tell a story, maybe first about what the immigrant community did for your family, if there's a story of how that sacred ground was held when you were a kid and what that meant to you. And then an example of a person for whom you've held that space.
Yes, I'm happy to. And I will say it's something that happens, I think, with every client interaction. And it's beautiful to see my students also have that experience with their clients. So I'll start with the client and then I'll talk about my own experience since this is where I'm going with it. um, so I have a couple of stories, but
Go
I'll
for
talk
it.
about the clients that we've had specifically from Homeboy Industries. So our clients from
And I realize we haven't actually talked about what Homeboy Industries is. So maybe if you could preface the story by sharing with folks
yeah,
just the elevator pitch of what Homeboy is and what the community is about.
yeah. So Homeboy Industries is an organization here in Los Angeles that was founded by Father Greg. And he first founded it in response to a community need due to the gang epidemic that was occurring back in the 80s and 90s here in LA. And it's really grown to be an organization that provides wraparound services to individuals who've been formerly gang affiliated, formerly incarcerated, or who are at risk. They do everything from job training to parenting classes to legal services where we fall under. And so we decided to partner up with Homeboy Industries, not just because of our desire to work at this intersection, but because we also believe of the ability to help stabilize communities and families, right? Because I do
Mm.
get a lot of clients from Homeboy who are actually family members of homies, so who are not themselves members of gangs or anything like that. But the idea is like if we can give a family member status, that leads to stability within the family, right? Which also can help in terms of issues of recidivism and so on, you know? Um, and so our clients from Homeboy, though, can be sometimes a bit challenging to work with. And the reason why they're challenging is because they have so much distrust in the system, right?
Yeah.
The clients that I have had that have gone through there have been targeted, incarcerated since even though they were young kids, right? And even though they themselves were victims of crime, for example, or grew up in abusive households, the system failed to protect them. So we as attorneys often represent, not often, we represent that system to them. So there's a lot of distrust. So I always talk to discuss that with my students at first so that they understand the space that they're entering and who they represent, despite the fact that they also come from marginalized communities or students of color and so on. You know, you hold a privilege as a law student or as an attorney, and you represent at the end of the day the legal system that has also
Mhm.
oppressed your client. And so I've had multiple clients from Homeboy, but one in particular, Dunya. I don't know if you ever met Dunya.
You
Yes.
did.
Dunya is a client that I love with all my heart. She is now a legal permanent resident, and she talks about this publicly. So I think it's so I will also share is that she's a survivor of trafficking. And it took her a long time to come around and chat with us. And she often said that, women were the ones who harmed me because her trafficker was a woman. And she had just an innate distrust in women. And she told my student Erica, and she put Erica through the ringer. Let me tell you, she would fail to show up appointments. She wouldn't respond. She would give an attitude. And Dunya even would say, like, that was my way of testing because I had so much distrust in you all, because don't want to say they reminded me of my trafficker, but, she had so much distrust in women because of the harm she experienced as a child and as a teenager. And she would tell us, like, by you listening, by you advocating for me, by you being there with me, you have restored my trust in women. And so that's an example of entering that sacred ground and understanding what you might represent for your client. And by you taking the time, it's really on you as the advocate to establish that rapport, to build that trust, and meet your client where they're at. And Dunya told us too, she shared with us things that she hadn't shared with anybody in her entire life. And just knowing that, you are entering a space of high vulnerability, and you try your best. And I tell my clients all the time, like, our duty is to, and it hurts me that you have experienced this in life, but how can we use it to empower you, right? And to provide you with some sort of security or comfort, knowing that you can remain in the United States. And now Dunya advocates for other trafficking survivors,
Wow.
And she often says that, she felt so much shame being a survivor of trafficking that we, in fact, empowered her. And now she wants to use her own experience and her ability to work and remain in the United States to serve other members of her community. That's an example of, I think, the
That's
importance of
incredible.
entering that sacred ground and also
Mm,
recognizing that there's going to be tensions, right? Because who you might represent to your client and so on. And that because they're allowing you to enter this sacred space, it's
mm,
really on you, right?
mm.
To take the time to listen and to use the resources and the privileges you have to guide your client and represent them.
Wow.
So that's one of many stories, but it's one that I really hold close to my heart, also because who Dunya means to me, I think for the rest of my life. Her and I will always have a very special bond. She cracks me up.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. One through so much,
yeah.
just going through those stories of trauma and
Hmm.
building trust through being a safe space.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
And it was really modeled off also just my own experiences.
Yeah.
So when we came to the United States shortly thereafter, when I came, my family and I experienced homelessness,
Mm.
and I was about 3 or 4, and I actually remember this time quite fondly. The reason being is that my dad had a friend here who his name was Khan, and he was Pakistani. He and his family had recently immigrated to the United States as well, and they offered us refuge. And we lived with them for about, I think, a month or two. And I think about this time, and I remember it, and I think of it fondly because they had kids as well. So I remember
Mm.
being able to play with Mukta, Sima, and Jihad. Um, and it's that idea of, again, community recognizing community, and a Mexican family and a Pakistani family,
Yeah.
living under one roof, where language, even though Khan spoke English and so did my dad, but my mom and Jasmine, who was his wife, did not, but find in commonality, right? And I think that's one of the beautiful things about the immigrant experience is that despite we coming from different cultures or different countries, there's a thread of commonality, and that commonality is leaving home, right? And understanding
Mm.
the struggles of leaving home and recognizing and seeing one another. And that has been my experience, right? So then after we lived with them for about 2 months, my dad was able to finally get us back on our feet, and we moved to these apartments in Culver City. So when my dad was working, my mom and I were at home, and it was an Iranian family that lived next door to us. And Sakura, seeing who was the woman that lived next door, realizing that my mom and I were by ourselves, offered community, right? And so
Oh.
she befriended my mom. And even though Sakura and my mom, again, didn't speak any English,
Hmm.
finding commonality through food. So Sakura would always invite us
Mm.
to come over next door. And she kind of, to me, became like a grandmother of some sort, right? Like a caring, doting grandmother when I was a kid. My grandma was in Mexico, right? So she was able to fill that space, and she had 2 kids, not kids, they were already adults too, Aras and Omed, that were in their early 20s probably. And I remember them just being like, if they were my older cousins, right? Being silly, being willing to play with the kid. And then upstairs lived my tío Mauro, who was, he was not Portuguese. He was from Brazil. That's why I was like, he was Brazilian. Um, Also adopted my family when we first arrived, and would accompany me and my mom to buy groceries and stuff like that as my mom was trying to navigate in a new world. And that has been my trajectory since life. And then when I was in elementary school, my dad was an epileptic and had a set of seizures that basically left him comatose for a
Mm.
while. And my mom at this point was working 2 jobs. And then it was a Honduran family that stepped in to help. I had befriended a little girl when I was in kindergarten. Her name was Vanessa, and her mom, Soraya, and her dad, Soraya and Javier, really supported my family during this time of need and would take care of my dad and take care of me while my mom would go work 2 jobs. And even
Wow.
though even when I've been in high school, I mean, then in high school and college, one of my greatest mentors, Maria Villa, is an immigrant herself, right? I was born in Tijuana, knew that I wanted to be an attorney, and has guided me through the process. So it's just examples of community seeing community. And like I said, and I also have experiences also of people who are not immigrants who helped me a lot, like my tia Anne, who helped me when I was in school learning how to read. But it's this whole idea: community seeing community, entering sacred ground during times of need, and offering that support and lifting one another. And I really acknowledge all of them in my own personal trajectory and what I'm doing now, because I wouldn't be the person who I am, and I don't think I would have reached these level of privileges if it wasn't for my immigrant community, for the not just the immigrant but the community coming together to lift my family and I up. So I try to replicate that as much as I can through my work.
That is so beautiful. And how formative for a child to be surrounded by people of so many different backgrounds and experiences and to know those folks as family.
Yes. And, it's, I've been much more open about my own family history now. My mom is she would freak out if she listened to me on this podcast and the many times that I've talked about it, which also reflects the immigrant community about the needing to save face.
Sure.
But I've decided to be more open also because I just know, like, for example, with my students, like the importance of stories like this to be heard, because I know it resonates with them and there's similar experiences that they've had. And despite the difficult childhood that I did have to a certain extent, it was still one that was filled with love and support. And I acknowledge that. And I really believe, I don't want to say struggle gives you purpose. And, I try to steer away from the term resiliency too, right? Because, like, why do we have to be so resilient? But it's really those experiences that have come full circle and who've provided me with this sole purpose, I feel, to do this work.
Mm.
And I don't, and I think, and I have had like these identity issues recently about, like, what if my family would have never left Mexico? What would my life be
Mhm.
like? I don't think I would be doing this, because so much of it is because of the experience I had and the experience my family had that has made immigrant rights work my call.
Would you say more about that sense of call and how that began to emerge in you, how you identified that as a young person?
Yeah. So, growing up, My family always did, and I think as most immigrant families, no, well, not most, because some experience like a pretty strong push towards assimilation. Versus my family, it was very much being prideful of who you are and where you come from. So I always understood that I was Mexican, right? I did go to a predominantly white high school. I went to Maricosta in Manhattan Beach, where I did have a sense of of knowing that I was in fact different, right?
Mm.
Which can be a lot for especially when a teenager when you're trying really hard to fit in. And so I did have my own, I think, like identity journey during that time and trying to fit in, but also recognizing the fact that I'm Latina. And when I go home, it's definitely we speak Spanish and we're a Mexican family, which is very different from what my classmates and their families were like. Um, and I think too that was in fact part of my experience that led me to do this work. Because when I was in high school, I was an activist, I guess. I was a nerdy
Mm.
activist.
The best kind.
Yeah, the nerdy kind. And this was back in the day when California attempted to give undocumented folks licenses, and it did not pass. And they staged a day without a Mexican. So this was like
Right.
2004, I think.
Which, if I remember right, was the biggest mass protest in American history up until like the Women's March
Yes,
in
correct.
2020 or 20, yeah,
And
2016.
I had a teacher, Miss Quintero, that basically who like what educated us on the issue and told us like I'm not coming to work, right?
Hmm.
And she very much empowered me. And I went home that day and I told my mom and my dad that I was not going to go to school because I was protesting, which, if you know, it does not fly with immigrant families because they did not bring you to this country to protest by not going to school. Um, but my parents allowed me to do it, but didn't write me a note. So I was truant
Mm.
for some of my classes, and my teachers were shocked because they were like, "How can nerdy Marissa be truant?" And they asked me about it. And a couple teachers were like, "Oh, okay." But two in particular took a lot of interest as to why I decided not to attend school. One of
Mm.
them actually asked if I'd be willing to present to my classmates. And I think it was her way of trying to empower in me and also educate the community as to issues that the undocumented community was facing in California. And I said yes, I was super excited. So I presented in class and it did not go well, you know, because of the neighborhood that my school was located in, right? It's pretty conservative, pretty white. And my class presentation ran over 2 days because it became so controversial. And
Wow.
to the point where some of my classmates told my teacher, Ms. Bozeman, if Marissa speaks about this again in class, we're not coming to class. Yeah.
Wow.
And that was, and I had experienced issues of discrimination growing up, but that was like the true big slap in my face of like, oh, wow, this is what who I think are my colleagues, my friends, think about me, think about my family, think about my community. And after that, I was like, I'm not down for this, right? And I was like, and I'm going to throw it down. And I knew since then that I wanted to do immigrant rights work. So I started becoming involved in the immigrant rights movement in high school after that experience. And it went into college. And so when I was in college, I was very politically active. I was in Mecha, the USC. And then I worked at the USC Immigration Clinic. And I thought that professor had the coolest job. I would tell him, I was like, this is such a cool job because you represent people and still get to work with students. And I would joke around that one day I was going to take his job. And he even told me when I first started, he's like, oh, wow, you really did it. As I was following your footsteps. Um, and so, yeah, I think that was the, like, I always was well aware of my experience. I knew that I wasn't born here. I knew that I went with my mom when she became a US citizen. But it was, I think, the first time where the light bulb kind of went off in the sense of like, this is what I'm going to do. And I've stuck to it since then. Yeah.
Mm. That clear-eyed young passion has continued to guide you. And
Yeah.
you've deepened into what that call means, but what a gift to have from such a young age, that sense of this is it. This is the thing that I can do. This is the vocation for me.
Yeah, I will say there was times, especially in law school, where I was like, because like I would get told like maybe you should diversify your resume, have different experiences, but no to this, and that's why I feel like this is. I feel very fortunate, like who at such a young age can say they were certain as to what they wanted to do. I have had thought about like what if I could tell younger Marissa what she was doing. I don't think I would have never thought it would be to this level.
Yeah.
Um, I would have been satisfied just being an immigration attorney. But the fact that now I get to teach others, that I get to go back to my home country and do this work, it's incredibly, incredibly special.
Hmm. I remember when you and I first met, I would have been 22. I started volunteering at Homeboy right out of college because I'd read Father Greg Boyle's book, Tattoos on the Heart, which I recommend to all of our listeners. And I was like, I have to be part of this. I need to be a part of this place, this community of kinship where folks are discovering their worth, that after society has thrown them away, that they in fact have dignity and value and can contribute to society and to community. And so in meeting you at when I was 22 and you would have been just a couple years out of law school, it sounds
Yeah.
like at that
I
point.
was
Um,
24.
24. Oh, we were
We were
babies. We
babies.
were so young. I looked, you were like this radiant light in that place for me
Oh,
because,
thank you.
most of the folks who come into Homeboy for the job training program and services are men. There's a good number of women too,
Hmm.
but a lot of
Hmm.
folks are men. And so it can feel like a very male dominant space.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
a lot of the staff as well. And so to see another young woman who was in that place and was just like full of confidence and full of life and so clearly attuned to why you were there. Not just in that space of Homeboy Industries, but like why you were in the world, your sense of purpose, your sense of vocation, and getting to hear some of the background that brought you there just illuminates for me that moment of encounter with you in that early season of you doing this work as an attorney. Um, and I'm so moved to reflect on my experience of you and then to see how you've flourished in this career and in this vocation is so incredibly inspiring to me within my own sense of vocation and the ways I seek to create sacred ground and to name sacred ground. Um, and I just long for that for younger people, for young adults, to have that experience too. Which leads me to be curious about your students.
Oh, yeah. I love
So
talking about my students.
yes. So tell me more
Yeah.
about this experience of mentoring. How do you choose the students? Did they choose you? Is it mutual? What is that relationship like?
Yeah.
Because there's plenty of people who are like, I'm going to go and I'm going to do this career. I'm going to have this vocation, and it may be one of incredible service to community, but there isn't that additional element of how do I raise up the next generation, which is so beautiful and so important. So, would you say more about that?
Yes, no. Well, thank you so much for your kind words, Lauren. I also remember you with as being such a bright and warm light as well. You're always with such positive energy and happy, even though there were times at Homeboy where it was like, oh man, this is burning down. You're like, we got this. I was like, we got this. We would have it. It would be fine.
As Dominique Frazier used to say, who was one of the folks who went through the program and was on
Yeah.
staff for a while, she always used to say to me, "The fun has arrived."
Oh man, yeah, no, the stories out of Homeboy Industries and these fun, but I wouldn't change it for the world. And Homeboy
Yeah.
has such a special place in my heart. And just a quick bit about Homeboy is that, talking about Full Circle and how that relates to the work that we do is, my dad has now passed away, but the homies would always make fun of me and be like, "Why do you want to help us? Like, you grew up in Manhattan Beach, you went to high school, in Manhattan," and they would always give me a hard time. And my dad rolled through one day, and then the homies were like, "Oh, we know why you help us." And I was like, "Oh my God, you all remind me of my dad." So full circle as to why. But
Amazing.
I credit my dad for giving me the much needed attitude and confidence, we'll say, to work with this population. But yes, back to your question, I absolutely love teaching. And I will tell you that practicing law and doing immigrant rights work can be incredibly, incredibly draining. And just seeing the energy and las ganas, to say, of my students to throw it down is what really revitalizes me at times.
Mm.
That young, eager energy that you have as a law student and an attorney that sometimes kind of dissipates as you practice law.
The
Yeah, the
idealism.
idealism and that hope that and remembering that you can in fact make a change.
Mm.
So mentoring had always been a big part of my life, even though when I was younger, and so I knew that I would like teaching. And in terms of my students, the students have to interview to be part of the clinic. I wish I could take every single student, but we can't. But I usually look for students who really have the heart and who I can tell that will put in the work to really represent and work with this client community that can be challenging at times. And my students range in backgrounds, but the majority of them are called to this work for a reason. So most of them are students of color, first generation, immigrant themselves, and I've had students who are also documented or undocumented actually be in the clinic. I've also have a handful of amazing and kick-ass white students who are called to do this work because they see how unjust it is. And
Mm.
as I always tell my white students, like, we need you all, right? Because we need you to go educate your community and help us. So that's kind of like a survey of who's in my clinic class. I also teach immigration law to students here at Loyola, and those students come from an array of backgrounds as well. But most of the closest work that I do are with my students in the clinic, and I really try to model the kind of lawyering and the kind of lawyer that I like to be and show them. So talking about being true to yourself. So I always tell my students, like, we are occupying a space that is not meant for us. I actually survey my students and ask them, how many of you have had a professor that looks like me? And the
Mm.
majority of them, maybe I'll get one or two who have had a Latina professor, right? And then I take it a step further. I was like, okay, but one that acts like me. They're like, nobody, right? And I tell them that I refuse to conform because it's not, if this place wasn't designed for me, then why do I have to conform to it? Versus I should create space and be who I am. And there's these notions of like who gets to be an attorney, right? You usually think of an old white man, in professional dress wear. Um, but that's not what attorneys have to look like. And so I even say that my outfits are part of my pedagogy. So if people at Loyola know this
Yes,
about
I
me,
love this.
yeah. And that's why you'll see me showing up with my Calavera t-shirt, or I wear a lot of Selena things and my big hoop earrings and my eyeliner because that's who I am. And attorneys can look any sort of way. And I want my students to understand that. So I actually make them do an activity where they have to share. It's kind of cheesy, but I tell them, like, you have to share something that is your true, authentic self and cannot do with the law. And I want you to continue to have that be a part of your life because they say law is a jealous mistress. It's very true.
Mm.
But I want that to continue to be part of your life because your career in the law doesn't define you. And I've learned wonderful things about my students. Some do spoken word. One of them even told me, you motivated me to publish a book on poetry. I've had students who do rock climbing, cheerleading, mariachi. And it's just been great to learn these things about them and to really embrace it and be who they are. So that's one of my biggest takeaways when it comes to mentorship is telling my students to really step into their power, right? Recognize that power, but also recognize that they themselves have power, especially if they come from marginalized communities, and that how they themselves can disrupt the system by just being who they are, because that in itself is a revolutionary act.
Yes.
And so that's one of the main takeaways I give my students. And then the second is this notion of love that I've discussed. And I tell them multiple times, I was like, no, no, no. Do not tell me you feel responsibility or that you're here to save somebody, right? If you're doing this work for this reason, then you should look for some other line of work. You are nobody's savior, right? And also, I hate saying responsibility because responsibility means that you have to carry some sort of weight, right? Like you have to have this weight of helping your community, right? Which causes resentment. And so I'm not down for that. So I tell students, if that's how you feel, then maybe this line of work isn't for you. You have to approach this as a true labor of love. The work that you do is an act of love for your community. And so really changing that notion. So those are like the two biggest pieces of mentorship that I try to give my students. Is it's really stepping into your identity and who you are, especially as first generation or immigrant students who grapple with this. I'm not from here or there. Where am I from? You are who you are, and no one gets to define your identity. And that's the thing, is that you can adopt things from your home country, from the United States, and that is who you are. So that's what I try to raise my little pollitos, is what I call them. Because they all know that I call them pollitos. I was like, once you graduate law school, you can be any sort of bird of your liking, but right now you're mine.
You are such a mother hen. I love that. I love that so much.
Yeah.
I mean, that's that pedagogy rooted in love is transformative. And I think about the folks I've met who've entered various kinds of helping and service-oriented professions, who have so much passion and so much vitality when they get started. And then 5 or 10 years in, they burn out and they decide, I can't do this anymore because I'm pouring so much of myself into this, and not getting anything back, not feeling like there's enough to fill the tank. And I hear you describing a way of engaging in the work that is mutual, where the love flows in every direction, from client and back again to student and back again, and then all mediated by community, all through community.
Yes.
And that's the only way that this kind of soulful revolutionary work can be sustained, is in the context of community, with all the complexities that includes.
Yes.
But that's the only way that we continue to do any of this work of social change, is when we're in communities rooted in deep love and kinship and respect and tenderness.
Yes, no, exactly. And and I think this is also something that I tell students too. It goes against our culture as Americans, right?
Yes, totally.
Because we are incredibly individualistic, and it's the whole idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And as members of the immigrant community or communities of color, we don't have to abide by that. No one should have to abide by that. Like I don't know, I can't think of another, I bet there are, but other cultures that are so individualistic like we are, and competitive with one another. When it's really community, like change happens through community. It's not just one person. And, part of this too is I tell my students too, like your client has a community, and we also need to learn to rely on that community to help our clients. Sometimes your client's immediate need is food, housing. We're immigration attorneys. We're not social workers, but then how can you tap into those resources within their community to provide them that support, but also with one another? And especially with this concept, like this work is hard and it's challenging and I love it, but there have been times where you grapple with this, like, is what I'm doing enough? Or is, like you do feel depleted. And there's this whole notion of self-care, and I've actually moved away from the notion of self-care, and now what I push forward is the idea of collective healing. And I tell my students in class, like, no more, I mean, trust me, I love a spa day, don't get me wrong, I love a facial and all that, but it's really relying on one another and sharing those moments of kinship, especially with your fellow advocates who understand how hard this work is, right? And the reason we do this work is also acknowledging is that there is a level of grief, grief for the injustices that we ourselves have experienced, our community has experienced. And that grief is what then becomes seen as anger, right? Or the push for activism, which can be helpful, but we have to take time to mourn those experiences, and we experience them, yes, ourselves, but also collectively, which is important to have this community where you can discuss and really rely on one another. Because that's the only way any of us will be able to survive and continue to do this work for the long haul. So it's really love and community, and really think about it as like, what's going to motivate me this is love. And I know it sounds corny to put love out in the world, but so many people do not know what love is. And love, and I don't mean just like the romantic love, but love for one another, this ability to see another person, another human, another soul. That in itself is an act of love, recognizing your brother or sister, and that's what you can do through this type of work. And that's what should motivate you to do this work, because that's what fundamentally will change. And I think speaks to the experiences I've had of clients who then pay it forward, it's because of the experiences they've had with us or with the clinic, not just us, but the community, and now they give that love back, Yeah.
Beautiful. It calls to mind, what you're saying calls to mind a conversation I heard Ms. Ruby Sales having a number of years ago, who's a civil rights elder. And she was asked about the rollback of civil rights legislation like the Voting Rights Act over the last 10 years or so. And her response to this question about what's happening, why is all of this legislation and all these systems that have been built to try to support justice, why is it all being rolled back? What's happening? Her response was that hearts were not changed. So yes, the policy, the legislation mattered. It could that there was change that needed to happen via that structural change, and that what sustains that change is love.
Mm-hmm.
Is hearts being changed, hearts being transformed in relationship. And I think about that all the time.
Yeah.
This idea of how do we move forward the kinds of massive change that needs to take place, not only for us to flourish in community as human beings, but just to survive at this point,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of just the mass structural injustices of the climate catastrophe, of the carceral state, of colonization. There's these massive injustices and systems of oppression. And what I hear you describing is the kinds of heart transformation through relationship that take place with love that are lasting kinds of changes. And you can't just have the structural change and expect it to be sustained in the absence of love, in the absence of relationship, which, I mean, Father Greg at Homeboy, he talks about this all the time,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
and you'll have to help me with the quote, because it's something like the methodology is tenderness and the context is kinship, something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, no, it's really hard to replicate. Father Greg, yeah. And I was going to say, like, that's the idea of kinship, right? And the idea is that when you build these relationships, he always says, we see the human, we no longer dehumanize, and that, especially in the context of working with people who, have been formerly incarcerated and are gang affiliated, that's so hard. So hard. I mean, so easy for others to just dehumanize them with not understanding their life stories, or how many of them fell into these situations because of their life circumstance, and that can be said by anybody. And we hear that, we hear that in the political context right now. And, everything we've been hearing about the immigrant community, and it's so easy to other people when they're not members of your community, when you don't see them or spend time with them. And I think about this too, like this, like, like the whole narrative of like, we need more money at our borders. Most Americans have never gone to the border, and I would actually like them to go and see how incredibly militarized our border is, and how much of a waste of money it is to keep funding and building a wall that's already there, And it's this idea of just othering and not seeing the people on the other side and understanding why is it that they are forced to leave, you know, and the experiences of violence that they have gone through, and for just the human basic necessity of wanting to survive, have been forced to flee. I think about like, well, of course I would do that for my family. Of course
Yeah.
I'm not a mother, but I would do that for my child. I would do that for my little sister. Um, because it's just within human nature to want to survive. And you have a right to a prosperous life. Everyone does. And it's really inviting the other side to have these conversations and really see. And I've had many students tell me like, I would never thought I would represent someone that had a criminal history, you know, and now I understand what led them to this place, right? Or even, you know, my clients being like, I never thought I'd meet this kid from Orange County who would come and represent me and win my case, right? So really seeing how is it that, you know, despite differences in class, race, so on, the ability to just come together and get to know one another is what builds this kinship and changes your heart, right? Because it's not, if it doesn't affect you immediately, then most people don't care, right? Um, and there are people who have those privileges where these things will not affect them, you know? Well, then take the time to get to know those who are being impacted, hear their stories, let them hear you. And I really think that is where we see that change in heart, you know? And I agree, you know, what's happening is anger, and we're seeing, you know, America's nasty face come forward. And I think that's also too something that I talk about in class a lot, is that we have to recognize that we are a system that is rooted in racism. You know, that's how America started, to be honest, you know, like oppressing Native American communities, slavery, and so on. Like that is innate within our culture and even within our laws. So it's like, how do we destruct that? And the only way you can do that, I feel, is through kinship, you know, when people are able to see one another and understand one another.
Mm.
Yeah, so one person at a time, but we're going.
we're going there together.
We're going there together. Yeah.
I wonder if there's a last word you'd like to leave with our audience in terms of what is bringing you hope right now.
Oh man, what is bringing me hope? The election is around the corner, and I've thought about this a lot recently, regardless of who wins. You know, I will say these last 4 years have been a nice recovery from the 4 years prior. Granted, they've been problematic themselves, but you know, as I tell my students, like, do we want bad or do we want horrible? Like, where do we want to fall in the spectrum? Is regardless of what is going on, understanding that you know, recently, especially with this new binational clinic, is I am where I'm meant to be, you know, and the work that I am doing and that I love with all my heart, and the community that I love with all my heart, will continue to be there. And it's the idea of, we just got to keep going and we're going to keep fighting. And I think that fight is what's giving me hope right now. So whatever is coming down the pipeline, um, I and my students are ready to throw it down.
Right. All right.
I don't know if that's necessarily hope, but I'm taking, I think, comfort in is knowing like I am where I'm meant to be at this moment, and I'm having these opportunities to help and support my community, and I'm going to do it regardless of the situation.
Yeah.
And for some reason, as I said, God, the universe, higher powers that be, have allowed me and my colleagues and my students to be in this place for a reason. And we're going to use our power and privileges to help and continue support to lift that community, despite the attempts of others to continue to oppress us. We've gotten some wins, and we're going to continue to have these wins. And So I guess I would leave with that. We just got to keep going, and we have one another. And again, relying on community, right? The community you serve, the community you belong to, your fellow colleagues and advocates. Like, we really got to rely on one another during these times. And collectively, we're going to make a change. We will continue to make a change.
Well, I'm so grateful for you and for the work that you're doing and for your clear, beautiful, joyful sense of vocation, courageous vocation in the world. So thank you so much, Marissa, for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.